Hello and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast. My name is Bob Wells. Today's guest is Professor Max Telford. Max is an evolutionary biologist at the Jodrell Chair of Zoology and Comparative Anatomy at University College London, where he founded the Centre for Life's Origins and Evolution in the Telford Lab. Max has won several awards for his research, including a visiting fellowship for All Souls College, Oxford, and he spent the last 3 decades researching the shape of the tree of life. His broader aim being to discover the earliest events in the evolution of the animal kingdom. Hello and welcome to the show, Max.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Great to have you on. Really enjoyed the book. Just before we start talking about the tree of life, could you just tell us a little bit about your life's journey, please, Max, and how you sort of became an evolutionary biologist and what prompted you to do that?
I think there were sort of two formative things. I grew up in the countryside, so surrounded by birds and bees, etc. I don't know if that had an effect. It felt like a lovely upbringing, I suppose. I used to rather unprofessionally collect, I don't know, mosquito larvae from the cattle trough and keep snails and stick insects and stuff. I was never one of those kids who sort of fanatically collected butterflies and knew all the taxonomy or anything. But you know, loved the natural world. And then I think the two formative things were David Attenborough's Life on Earth, which it was a book I read as a teenager and absolutely loved. Read it multiple times and obviously watched the series, which was fantastic. And watching Jacques Cousteau documentaries. I really wanted to be a marine biologist at one point. And that was, really my aim during my teenage years, was to become a marine biologist. But it turns out I get horribly seasick, so it wasn't really an option. But those two things sort of really turned me on to zoology and the natural world, and I guess the Life on Earth is all about the story of the eventual evolution of appearance and evolution of the animals, and that's something this is what I work on today.
And how did the book come about, Max?
Well, it's something I've been thinking about writing a book for a very long time, and I wanted to write a book about genetics, strangely enough. But at one point, I wrote to the editor, one of the editors at Nature, Henry G., and said, I want to write a review about how we interpret trees of relationship, trees of life. And he said, well, okay, write me a synopsis of what your review article is going to be about. And I wrote this synopsis, and he wrote back saying, this is far too long. This is a whole book's worth. And that was the sort of the aha moment. This is what I should be doing. Because there's so much to say. I mean, it's what I do, it's what I'm interested in, what I'm passionate about. And I think, as you'll have found out, I think, reading the book, the tree of life is sort of an interesting object in itself. It's an interesting problem. How do we reconstruct the tree of life? But there's also, it's interesting, and knowing how things are related is kind of interesting. But I think the real fantastic thing about the tree of life is that it allows you to travel back in time and sort of follow the events of evolution over the 4 billion years of life on Earth.
We've got approximately 40 minutes to have a chat about the tree of life, and we're looking at 4.2 billion years worth of evolution of life. So it'll be interesting to see how we travel so fast in that time. But I suppose the basic question I've got is why do we have a tree of life? I know everybody knows about the tree of life, but why do we use a tree, for example, to describe the life?
Well, it's a fantastic way of describing the process that produced the species that are alive today. So this is ultimately what we're trying to explain. We look around ourselves and see this incredible diversity of life. Some of it very obvious: trees and animals and insects and humans and all fungi and these large things. But also teeming multitudes of species of bacteria and single-celled eukaryotic cells throughout the ocean, algae and foraminifera, and et cetera, et cetera. So where did all that diversity come from? And essentially, there's a process that produced it, and it started off with a single original species, which we call Luca, the last universal common ancestor. And that was something that was produced over many hundreds of millions of years, but eventually would become the sole survivor of the early experiments in life. And that single species, you can think of that as the base of the trunk of a tree. You've got a single trunk, and as time passes, that trunk grows upwards, and at some point it splits in two. This single species will become two species, and that's obviously beautifully illustrated on a tree by a branch coming out from the main trunk. So you've gone from a single trunk to two branches. So it's a very good way of a tree is a very good way of illustrating that process where one species becomes two species become four, and that splitting process, that process of speciation, is represented in the pattern of the branches of the tree. And there's something else that's happening on the tree of life as life has evolved over time, which is that once those two species have separated, once a single species has become two separate branches independent of each other, they become different from each other. So they're free to go their own way. So, if you think of these bacteria, these simple organisms right at the beginning becoming two, they've had 4 billion years since then to become different from one another. And that is the process of evolution. And so that is represented on the tree by the length of the branches. So the splitting pattern is the speciation, the production of new species, and the growth upwards represents the amount of change happening as they become different from each other, and to produce not only the many species we have today, but the great diversity of species we have today. So in that sense, I think a tree is a very beautiful way of illustrating that. And it's something that took a long time for scientists to realize. So people were sort of talking about this was pre-evolutionary, but classifying animals into species into more and less similar groups. And they sort of draw these diagrams which split them into big, smaller and smaller groups, each smaller group within a larger group. And then eventually somebody said, hey, we could use a tree to illustrate this very beautifully. And that sort of happened finally right at the beginning of the 19th century.
I found it quite interesting where you were using the analogy of a tree almost to sort of start off at the bottom with Luca, last universal common ancestor, right up to the human, and how far and how long ago it was in deep time.
Well, it's very hard to picture the lengths of time we're talking about. So we think about a human lifespan of 80 years, 100 years if we're lucky, as, sort of fairly long span of time. But it's nothing in the context of the history of the Earth. And we can even think about the whole of human history. So history that has actually been recorded is probably, the first writing we have that actually records historical events, the earliest, is only about 8,000 years ago. And to go back to our common ancestor with a chimpanzee, so the very, very closest branch on the tree to us is the other chimpanzees. That's 1,000 times older than the very oldest bit of human history. And even that, that's our very, very closest ancestor. So this is a kind of a problem to try and picture this a huge amount of time passing. And an analogy I use in the book is to think of the history of the Earth as being represented by a human body. So the origin of the Earth, the coalescing of all the material that made the early Earth, happened about 4.5 billion years ago. And we represent that as being at the foot of this human time scale, if you want. And then today, the time that we're in now is the very top of the head. So the very top of your head. And so we can use that time scale to try and understand the vast periods of time that have elapsed compared to the span of a human lifespan. So if the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago at the soles of the feet, the first life appeared fairly quickly, actually, but not till the middle of the shins. And the first animals didn't happen until the bottom of the head. So really, really recently, about 600 million years ago. So less than a billion years ago. And the split between humans and chimpanzees happened right in the layer of skin on the top of your head. So hopefully that's sort of giving an impression of if we can imagine how long a human lifespan is, it's absolutely nothing in this huge context of time that has elapsed since the origin of life.
I'd like to go back to the very beginning. We said earlier the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life came, was it 4.2 billion?
I think it's a little uncertain, but I think generally think of it as about 4 billion years ago. Yeah,
I'm sure many listeners would be interested to know how that life started.
On the early Earth, we know that there was initially lots of steam in the atmosphere, but as it cooled, this eventually fell as rain and formed the oceans. And there was a lot of volcanic activity on the early Earth. So at the bottom of these oceans, filled with water, there was energy in terms of chemical energy, and lots of handy materials seeping out from these cracks, these fissures in the floor of the ocean, that could have provided the conditions for the very, very first sort of biochemical reactions rather than chemical reactions. I have to admit, I'm not a great expert on the origin of life. I've got colleagues at UCL who are much better informed about this. I'm a simple zoologist.
Perhaps we can have contact with those later. But the other thing that struck me is the sheer volume of species that we've got, both animal and plant. There's been more in history than what there is currently now. Is that right?
Yes, because most species are around for a few million years, and then they go extinct, and then one of their sister species takes over and radiates, producing multiple new species. But most of those will go extinct. If you imagine, if at every branching point we double the number of species as the tree grows, if they all survived, the Earth will be overrun with different species. So there's an awful lot of production of new species and extinction of slightly older species that have happened over the 4 billion years of the growth of the tree of life. So it's true to say almost all species of life on Earth are extinct. And so this is actually really important. It kind of makes you realize that, the extinct bits of life on Earth, that's, in a sense, that's where the real diversity is. And it's very frustrating that most of those species we'll never know, because most of those species will never have left a fossil.
One particular topic I found particularly interesting was the difference between convergent evolution and divergent evolution. Could you just explain that for listeners, please?
Yeah, we usually think about, I've sort of already talked about it, single species splitting into two, and those two species becoming different from each other. And that's kind of, the origin of species. This is Darwin's mechanism producing new forms that are different from each other. So we usually think of evolution as producing things that are different from each other, increasingly different. But we also see extraordinary examples where unrelated species, so species on fairly distant branches on the tree of life, so they're very distantly related, are strikingly similar. And they're sort of fairly obvious examples when you think about a dolphin and a shark. So a dolphin is a mammal, relatively closely related to sheep, for example. But, to a first glance, at least, they look very similar to a shark. They've got fins, they've got a dorsal fin, they've got a tail. Admittedly, a dolphin's tail goes up and down, and a shark's tail goes side to side. But you can see huge numbers of similarities. And obviously, this is because they both live in the water, and they have similar requirements for what works to swim quickly through the water. And so this is convergent evolution. This is coming up with different species coming up with similar solutions to similar problems of how to live. And the example I give in the book is slightly to my embarrassment. I'm no ornithologist. For most of my life, I believed that swifts and swallows, which look extremely similar, were very closely related. In fact, if you sort of look at a bird book, they're often sort of on pages.
They're together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But they're very distant. Well, as far in the context of the birds, they're very distantly related. So swifts, it turns out, are more closely related to hummingbirds, for example, whereas a swallow is more closely related to an owl than it is to a swift. And this seems extraordinary. And it's explained by convergent evolution. So swifts and swallows, from very different starting points, have evolved to eat insects on the wing. So this is how they're going to make their living. And so they've adapted their body using that, Darwin's process to become better and better at catching insects on the wing. And they've come up with very, very similar solutions. So they've got these thin, light, streamlined bodies, these backward sweeping wings, big beaks for their size, so they can sort of grab an insect as they fly past it. And actually, this is a really interesting phenomenon. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon on its own, this whole idea of convergent evolution. But from my point of view, as somebody who's trying to work out accurately the relationships between species, it's a sort of source of error, essentially. So my error, because I'm naive, I would have put swallows and swifts very closely together on my tree of the birds. And this convergent evolution is a source of error for all the work we do when trying to reconstruct the tree of life.
Something I found very interesting was that when we tend to think of evolution, we tend to think of things, being added to whatever it is. But there are many cases, and you can probably give us some examples, Max, of species that actually lose parts of their original body. Could you?
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, could you just give us some examples of that?
Yeah, of course. So this is a theme that almost unbeckoned sort of came out in the book, whereas over and over again, I sort of realised that yet again I was writing about an instance of loss. And so there's plenty. So we always, as you said, we always think about evolution as producing better and better and more complex and sophisticated organisms. But it's not always the case, or it's certainly not always the case that becoming better adapted requires more elaboration. Sometimes you want to get rid of things. So the apes, for example, we evolved from the group that includes the monkeys, and all of which have tails. In fact, basically all the mammals have tails, but we've lost ours. So that's a sort of very simple instance where we've actually lost a characteristic. There are more extreme examples. So I talk about a group of worms called the orthonectids, which are absolutely tiny, tiny parasites consisting of maybe 100, 150 cells. They have their entire nervous system consists of, it's 4 cells in the female and just 2 cells in the adult male. So these are incredibly simple animals. But we know from where they sit on the animal tree of life that they're related to the annelid worms. And annelid worms are things like the earthworm, Lumbricus, which might not sound very sophisticated to you, but they nevertheless consist of hundreds of thousands of cells. The brain of a leech, for example, has 10,000 nerve cells. So they are, relative to the orthonectid, they are incredibly sophisticated nervous system. And the orthonectid has thrown away almost all of this to pursue their lifestyle as a parasite, where they don't need a sophisticated brain. They don't need lots of muscles. They can be tiny and do very well in that circumstance. So there's lots and lots of examples where right across the tree of life, it's not just getting better and adding more and more. Sometimes, quite often, in fact, we species get rid of things. And actually, I was just talking about convergence being one of those cases where biology, evolution conspires to confuse us when we're trying to work out where things belong on the tree of life. And orthonectids are a great example of that. They're so simple that on their discovery, they were thought to be one of the very, very earliest branches on the animal tree. They're partway between a single-celled protozoan and, the more sophisticated animals. So sort of they were called mesozoa. So like telling you that they're halfway between protozoans and metazoans, so proper animals. And it's only with the use of molecular sequence data, where we compare the genes of different species, that we've been able to show definitively that these very, very simple, tiny, tiny parasites really do belong within the annelid worms. So they're not right at the bottom of the animal tree, they're right up near the top with very sophisticated relatives, or relatively sophisticated relatives, I should say. And so this simplification has initially, at least, fooled us into putting them in the wrong place on the tree.
I was going to ask you about, and you mentioned there about the genetics in terms of the progress of looking at the tree of life. Traditionally, I believe it was done through archaeology, or going back to fossils and things like that. But there's an increasing use of DNA for assisting in that research. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, yes. So there's multiple sources that we have used since the 19th century. So fossils, as you said, probably more so using morphology. So what are the physical features I'm always thinking about animals. So let's talk about animals.
Yeah.
So what are the features of, the backbone or the hair or the segments of an earthworm? So what characteristics are shared by different species, and those characteristics are essentially telling us that whether you're more or less closely related. So these are these characteristics, and so through the 19th and at least half of the 20th century, we were using morphological characteristics and features of embryology as well. How your embryo develops was a big clue as to which branch of the animal tree you belong to. And then sort of towards...
Sorry to interrupt. So that would be if you got an animal that has got its embryo within its body, and then something else has got an egg. Is that the difference you're making there?
Well, it's all sorts of things. So if you actually watch animals develop, you can see characteristics of the way their embryos are gradually form that are shared between them. So the classic example is to look at is from Ernst Haeckel, where he looked at the embryos of all the vertebrates, and essentially you can see that they all pass through this very similar stage. Anything from a human to a shark pass through this very similar stage, where essentially we have gill slits, for example. And Haeckel sort of took this a very long way and said we were sort of passing through our evolutionary history as we developed, which has some truth in it, but not as he pushed it quite a long way. But those characteristic stages of embryogenesis, of the formation of the embryo and the gradual transition from an egg to an adult, are huge clues as to how we're related.
Yeah.
So all the annelid worms will form their segments in a similar way, and all the insects will form their legs in a similar way, and all the vertebrates will form their vertebral column in a similar way. And it's that process of embryogenesis that can contain many clues telling us how things are related. Sorry, okay, I think you were asking me about molecular data.
So just to summarize, what we're saying is that you can use fossils, you can use morphological reasons, and more recently, DNA. It's basically those three things?
Yes, yeah, essentially. I mean, in a sense, you can use any character that is encoded in the genome. So it has to be something that gets passed on from across time and down the tree of life. So any character which is encoded in the genome. So that could be biochemistry or morphology or embryology or anything.
Yeah.
But essentially, what we've been doing since sort of, I guess, starting in the late 60s, is use it when we first started getting sequences from the very first genes and the very first proteins, and realizing that these sequences, the A's, C's, G's, and T's of DNA, and the 20 different amino acids that make these long things which are proteins, these change very gradually, and the changes get handed down just the same way that a backbone gets inherited by all of the vertebrates, or the segments get inherited by all of the annelid worms. And so rather than looking at, a couple of hundred morphological characters, which are quite hard to find and take an awful lot of study, not suddenly, it took many years to get to the stage we're at now. But today, we can look at literally millions of nucleotides, the letters of DNA, and the amino acids of proteins as characters which, just like a morphological character, have been evolved and changed and handed down from generation to generation, and are a record of relationships, just in the same way that the morphological characters we were just talking about are a record of relationship.
It's interesting. One question that it's just arisen in my head is the progress that we've made in terms of understanding the tree of life since Victorian times, for example, or even before that. Has it accelerated over the last sort of 25 years with more use of computers? And the second part of that question, bonus question, is with AI, is that going to make things even more easier to get? And will we get more data to be able to build up the tree of life?
Yeah, I'm not sure AI is. Well, I'm sure AI is going to help, but I'm not sure in what way. I think, but saying that the increasing. So I sort of started my career as a tree builder with my PhD starting in 1989, so a long time now. But over that period, there's the amount of DNA data we have available has grown exponentially every year. It's gone, in my PhD, I probably sequenced about 20,000 DNA letters over 3 years, and now you could do 3 billion in a morning. I mean, literally. So it's extraordinary the increase in the amount of information that's coming from DNA, and it has changed our view of a lot of things. So it's really, really transformed our view of, for example, the animal kingdom. And I think that really comes down to the fact that with morphology, we're more likely to be fooled by these problems of convergence and of character loss that we've talked about.
Like the swallow and the swift, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the orthonectid, this tiny parasitic worm that's thrown away lots of characters. So based on morphology, it looks very simple. And it's only when we look at its DNA that we find these clues that really it's a more complicated animal. It's not quite true of the swallows and the swifts. I think the ornithologists were much smarter than me. And when they looked at the skeletons of swallows and swifts, they could see where they really belonged. They didn't need any DNA, but that has nevertheless been confirmed by DNA analyses.
Do we know how many, talking animals here rather than plants, do we know how many living animals there are on the planet? Can we guess what there is?
Yeah, there's lots of guesses. I think that probably the best guess is about 10 million species of animals, most of which, in fact, are insects. So the insect, the arthropods, these things with jointed legs, so insects and spiders, crustaceans and the millipedes and the centipedes. That's about 3/4 of animal species. They're not necessarily very disparate, so they might all be kind of similar, but there's an awful lot of slightly different variations on a theme. 350,000 species of beetle, for example. So I think probably about 8 to 10 million is probably the best guesstimate.
And that will be excluding bacteria and various types of plankton, I guess.
Absolutely. So the vast majority of species are probably undescribed bacteria. So the bacteria are quite hard to study. They're very small. And so some of them are, grow wonderfully on cheese, for example, or on your Petri dish. But many, many, many of them don't. And so trying to study them, I sort of liken to trying to describe a cake from a single crumb. It's very, very difficult to grasp what the species is like. And to study them and to know what species there are. But we've got new methods today. It's called environmental DNA sampling, where essentially you go into any environment on Earth, scoop up some water or sample the air, and just see what DNA is there. So even if you can't see the organisms there, the bacteria mostly, you can still sample their DNA, because we can deal with absolutely minuscule amounts of DNA and still work out what it looks like and what sort of species it is and how many different species there are. And there's some extraordinarily large estimates for how the total diversity of life on Earth, if we include all the bacteria, of as many as 1 trillion, which I think is probably rather high, and it's certainly a lot. There are many times more than we've actually described, but it's not impossible that there are 1 trillion species, mostly bacteria, on Earth.
So I'll stick with there's lots of them.
Yeah, good idea.
Now, this may come across as a naive question, and you've already meant the numbers, but I have to ask it. Is there a drawn-up tree of everything, of these 10 million animals anywhere?
There are efforts to do that, and the problem, in the sense, or what one kind of problem, is that to stick into my computer all the data from 10 million animals and have it spit out a tree is almost impossible. So what we have to do is break the problem down, divide and conquer, essentially. So I'll do, you can do something on all the vertebrates, and I'll do something on the annelid worms, and we can do all those separately, and then do a separate tree that connects those different branches together. So there are efforts on there are websites on the available where you can go and zoom into different bits of the tree of life and see our best estimate of every species that's actually been studied and people have tried to place in the appropriate place. But it's probably almost certainly there aren't 8 million animals that we can look at their positions. There's probably much smaller number that have actually been deliberately studied, if you will.
Yes, and I think your book would have been considerably thicker had you attempted to even put one line. You mentioned, and there's a number of, you talk about the various people that have been involved in the sort of recent history of discovering the tree of life. And some very interesting stories. Are there any particular characters that you'd like to talk about that perhaps have left quite a big impression with you?
I think probably, two people. So I talk about Carl Woese in the book, and Carl Woese made an extraordinary discovery in the 70s where he was studying what he thought was, so we've always thought that there are sort of two kinds of life. There's the very simple bacteria, which don't have a nucleus, and we call them prokaryotes. That means before the nucleus. And then there's the more sophisticated organisms that do have a nucleus, and those are called eukaryotes. That means with a nucleus. And so life was essentially divided into those, more sophisticated and less sophisticated, sort of bacteria, and then all the other things, which includes humans and plants and fungi and lots of single cell things, but they all have a nucleus. And what Carl Woese did was to study many different kinds of bacteria. And what he actually found was that there was two very, very different kinds of bacteria called the archaea and the eubacteria. So the eubacteria are the sort of familiar ones, things that we use penicillin to get that cause us disease, etc. And then there's a weird group, the archaea, which tend to live in very inhospitable environments. But essentially what Carl Woese showed was that archaea and eubacteria, these two very, very simple kinds of animals, were as distantly related to one another as either one was to the very, very different looking eukaryotes. So rather than there being two branches to the tree of life, the sophisticated eukaryotes and the simple prokaryotes, there were actually three. So three domains of life. So much older and more encompassing than kingdoms of life. So the animal kingdom is a tiny bit of one of these domains of life. So that was an extraordinary contribution. And the other guy who comes to mind is somebody called Joe Felsenstein, who's a professor in the University of Washington, I think now, who just made some extraordinary contributions to the way we reconstruct the tree of life, especially using molecules. The theory behind it and the methods we use to try and get an accurate tree and not make any mistakes, especially using molecular data. So he wrote papers that in the 70s, which are still cited frequently today, and it was really an extraordinary contribution.
What are the biggest controversies in the tree of life? What do you scientists disagree on?
Well, I'm obviously most familiar with the arguments about the relationships between big animal groups, and there are two which I've sort of been involved in, slightly wounded by some of these arguments. And one of them concerns the very first branch within the animals, and there's sort of the long-standing idea was that a sponge. So sponges are very simple animals, don't do very much, sort of sit there filth feeding at the bottom of the sea, and these were long thought to be the earliest branch within the animals and essentially outside of the main group of animals. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, somebody said there's another group called the sea gooseberries or comb jellies, which look rather like jellyfish. And they said, well, it's not the sponges at the bottom of the tree. It's actually these slightly more sophisticated animals called comb jellies, which kind of doesn't seem to make sense. So, why would you prefer a complex animal at the bottom of the tree, the very first animal being already complex, rather than starting off gradually with a very simple sponge and then sort of building up complexity? And this is a story that runs and runs and runs, and has been covered in the New York Times and Le Monde recently, these arguments about which of these two branches is the first, and people don't seem to be able to come to a conclusion. Now, I have my own ideas. I think the sponges were first, but not everyone agrees. And then I spent a lot of time working on a group called the xenocoelomorphs. And again, I think this is a case, like we've just already discussed, of a complex animal throwing away characteristics become much simpler. So it's sort of evolution from complex to simple, and that being something that fools us about where they belong on the tree of life. So there's a big group of animals called the bilateria. So these are all the animals that have a left and a right side. So humans and insects and crabs, etc. And there's a discussion essentially about whether this very simple group, the xenocoelomorphs, belong just outside that group, and this is evidenced by their simplicity. So they're sort of just outside this unique club of sophisticated bilaterally symmetrical animals, or whether they actually belong within that club, and we're being fooled by their simplicity into thinking that they're somewhere else, essentially. So I've had a lot of toing and froing with different people about that particular. And it's obviously rather esoteric argument, but very interesting nonetheless, because it tells us about the earliest evolution of the animals.
I'd like to talk about us, humans. I think I'm right in saying that Homo sapiens are 300,000 years old?
Well, it's. I guess it's somewhat difficult to know for certain, but that sounds about right. As I think I should point out, I'm an expert on worms and I'm not an anthropologist.
I was going to ask you about worms. Can we park that thought and talk about worms a bit later?
Absolutely.
I'd love to.
Always ready to talk about worms.
Yeah. So let's say 300,000, which actually isn't that long, really, is it, in the scheme of things at all? Is there any evidence in terms of how the Homo sapien has actually evolved and is evolving at all? Has any work been done into that?
Yes. Well, we've got our closest living relative are the chimpanzees. So we can say, well, what's in common to the humans and the chimpanzees, and look at the morphology that we share, and extrapolate that back to our common ancestor, which lived about 8 million years ago. So that is the starting point of human evolution as an independent branch. But along that branch, there are no other living hominins, so human relatives, still surviving. So the only thing we've got to go on is our fossils. So we can find fossils, 7 million, 6 million, 5 million years ago, which are clearly offshoots of the branch that would eventually lead to Homo sapiens. And we can look at the change in their skeletons as they become increasingly human-like over that 8 million year period. So we see them starting to walk upright, their brain getting bigger, they're becoming less well adapted to climbing trees and better adapted for walking on two legs. This perhaps, we speculate, not climbing trees allowed their hands to evolve differently, but to become good at holding things and manipulating things and doing sort of fine motor skills that we have today. And ultimately, the brain becoming bigger and evidence from the skeleton for the evolution of language. So little bones in the throat, which we associate today with our ability to speak, for example. So we can follow that through those 8 million years through those fossil humans until we get to something that ultimately essentially looks like Homo sapiens that we recognize today.
I was thinking, and I was thinking in terms of the evolution of our brain, for example. I was talking to an academic about eyes, and he was saying that there's more and more problems with people with eyes because they're not getting the right amount of daylight that they used to get when we worked in the fields and all that. And also computer screens. And it was just a thought about brains, because obviously we're very much reliant upon, we've all got smartphones, we're very much reliant upon we don't need a short-term memory. If we want to find something out, we quickly look at it. It's in, it's out. I just wonder whether that's something that comes within your domain, or whether that's something that you thought about at all.
Well, I think, it's a problem, and that we're all distracted by the stupid devices in our pockets, but it's not something that has changed our evolution yet, because so we've had smartphones for 20 years, we've had computers for 30 years, and the annoyances and the distractions of the internet for 30 years maximum, probably much less actually. So that's not nearly enough time to change our genes. So changes to our genes, changes to our morphology, changes that actually get recorded in our genome take many generations to build up, to make any difference, any noticeable difference whatsoever. So it might be that we're not adapted we're not adapted over the 8 million years of evolution since we parted company from the chimpanzees. We're not adapted to sitting indoors and staring at screens and not getting enough vitamin D. But because this is modern life has happened so incredibly recently, we haven't had a chance for evolution to adapt our genomes to the new reality.
But it could do.
It could do. I'm sure it will do over time if we don't kill ourselves beforehand.
Well, I promise you, we will talk about worms. But one thing I would like to talk about is an amazing creature which I read about, and you've got quite a bit in your book about it. The coelacanth. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Beautiful.
Fantastic. Could you just tell us a bit about that? I mean, it's 400 million years old and still alive. Well, not the original one, but they're still around from 400 million years ago.
Yeah, they're sort of interesting in two ways. First of all, they are more closely related to humans. It's a fish, undoubtedly a fish, lives underwater, gills, scales, fins, etc. It's undoubtedly a fish, but it's more closely related to a human than it is to a trout or a goldfish. So it's part of a group called the, oh my goodness, I can't remember. Oh, this is embarrassing. Anyway, it's called, I'm just going to use the it'll come to me in a minute, but the common English term is the lobe-finned fishes. So they've got these fins that have got little bones in. So a goldfish fin has just got what are called fin rays, these very thin little bony protrusions. But this has got a proper, solid, bony core to its limbs. And as we look at those limbs, we can actually recognize bones that are direct equivalents of the bones that we have in our arms and our legs. So a humerus, a radius, and ulna. There are equivalents in the coelacanth's fins that are equivalent to our own limb bones. And so these fleshy fins, these lobe fins, are essentially what would eventually evolve into our limbs as the relatives of the coelacanths pulled themselves onto land and evolved into tetrapods, so four-legged creatures. So it's interesting in that it's sort of essentially a precursor of all the creatures that walk on land with four legs. But it's also interesting in that it's what we call a living fossil. So we recognize a coelacanth in rocks from the Devonian, which is about 400 million years ago. And then early in the 20th century, to everyone's enormous surprise, one was discovered living in the Indian Ocean. So these creatures essentially have survived almost unchanged for 400 million years with their perfect design, unimprovable in some sense, hanging on maybe by the skin of their teeth, but in some sense surviving 400 million years without actually changing very much at all.
And where are they found?
Well, the first one was fished out of the Indian Ocean off the coast of South Africa, but they're found off the Comoros Islands, off Madagascar, And I think there's a new species been found in the, further east in the Pacific. I'm not sure exactly about that, but that sort of area. And they live in caves about 300 meters below the surface.
Oh, wow. Your specialism is, and we mentioned it earlier, worms. What does your work involve with worms, and what do you achieve from doing this work with worms?
Well, I think the big thing you need to know is that most kinds of animals are worms. So I told you that most species are insects, but that's a single kind. The arthropods is one, what we call a phylum, so a fundamental distinct body plan. So all the arthropods have segments and jointed legs, essentially. So that's one. We belong to another one of these phyla called the vertebrates. We all have a vertebral column. And there are about, I've also talked about the annelids. These have a segmented body. They look like an earthworm. So there are, of those fundamental kinds of animals, there are about 30. We slightly argue about what constitutes a phylum, but let's say there's about 30. And of those 30, 25 are worms. So of the 30 distinct kinds of animals, almost all of them are a kind of long, slender thing called a worm. So if you want to understand the diversity of the animal kingdom and the early evolution of the animals, you have to work on worms. So working on vertebrates, very interesting, but you're only looking at 1/30th of the diversity of animals. Similarly, looking at all those millions of species of insects, you're still only looking at the diversity of 1/30th of all the animals. So to encompass the diversity of animals, you have to look at worms. So I've compared this to everyone's so interested in the vertebrates, and if the vertebrates were a mode of transport, they'd be cars. And there's lots of different cars. There's big ones and small ones, and four-wheel drives, and sports cars, and red ones and blue ones. So a huge diversity. But if worms were modes of transport, if the vertebrates are cars, the worms would be a hot air balloon and roller skates and a submarine and a parachute. And so you can sort of understand that the worms actually encompass the great diversity of kinds of animals.
And give us an example of the type of work that you would do with your researchers.
Well, so I've talked a little bit about what we do. So we are interested in the difficult problems, the unanswered problems. So, for example, I talked a little bit about the work we did on orthonectids, this incredibly simple animal that people thought were barely even animals at all. And so we essentially looked at the DNA and the protein sequences of an orthonectid and compared this with all the other groups of animals that they could belong to. And what we discovered was that when we looked at the DNA, it showed us that orthonectids shared a lot of characteristics of their DNA with the annelid worms. And essentially it was telling us that these very, very, very tiny, simple worms actually belong to the animals. And that was a real discovery. So that then tells us something about their evolution. That tells us they're related to all these very complex, large worms with sort of relatively big brains, but they're tiny and very simple. And that's telling us that they evolved from something much more complex and have become simple over the last, 100, 200 million years. And so that's the kind of question we're asking. We're looking at the difficult bits of the tree and asking whether we can come up with clever methods to overcome the problems that I've described. So the problems of convergent evolution, problems of losing characteristics, the problems of some animals evolving very quickly, humans evolved from something that looked like a coelacanth, but so did a coelacanth. So over the same 400 million year period, one branch of these fishes has turned into a human, and the other branch still looks like a coelacanth. So different branches of the tree are evolving at incredibly different rates. Some of them evolving incredibly quickly, some of them evolving incredibly slowly. And this is another source of error when we're building our trees. So essentially, we're trying to work out ways to overcome, to spot these problems and to find a way around them. So we get we work out the true relationships between these different groups of animals.
I can see we're running out of time now, Max. It's been a really fascinating conversation. What I would say about the book is it's a fantastic book. Who would you say the book is aimed for?
Well, I think it's for anyone who's interested in how the world works. So my best example is my wife, who's an English graduate, doesn't really read science, but she's hand on heart tells me it's a genuinely held belief. She really enjoyed it, and I've had that from a lot of friends who are non-scientists. So I hope it's sort of written at a level that anyone who's interested in how we study the tree of life and what it can tell us about life on Earth will be able to understand and follow the arguments.
I'd certainly mirror what your wife said. It was a fantastic, tremendous book to read. What I found was, yes, there's some sort of words that you're perhaps not familiar with, but if you take a bit of time to look them up or whatever, I think that gives it. But you've written in, there's some subtle humour in there, which I liked.
Good.
Just subtle, not too much. But it was absolutely fascinating, and we could talk all morning about this, but I think it's really good. So Max, thank you for coming on the show. We'll put a note of the book in the show notes. And do you have a website at all that people can go to?
I have a website at UCL, so you can look me up at University College London, with my name, you'll find me. And I'm on Blue Sky as well. If anyone wants to follow
right? Okay, we'll put all that in the show notes. So thank you for coming on the show, Max.
It's been a great pleasure.